Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your letters. We've received quite a few in the past couple of weeks, and I read each and every one of them and appreciate them. And particularly the guy who stood up for me after my admonishing a couple of programs back. That was very nice. This week, we talked to President Jefferson about the period prior to the onset of the American Revolution, with an attitude of, what was the British point of view? Should we take time to understand that?
The British view was, man, they're touchy. We win the World War for them, the French and Indian War, which, by the way, George Washington helped to touch off. And now we've done all this, and not for us, mostly for them, these Americans. All we want is for them to pay some small amount of the national debt. We're going to tax some playing cards. We're going to tax some newspapers. We'll tax some stamps, tax a little tea. And every time we try to do some kind of mild-mannered revenue generation system, the Americans flare up and go nuts and write pamphlets and broadsides and march in the streets and burn George III in effigy. What's wrong with these Americans? Don't they get it that they need to pay their fair share? These are not onerous taxes. This is just sort of what you do when you've just won a very important world war, which, by the way, opened up the entire Ohio Valley for these Americans. So why can't they just get on board with a rational tax system? So that's essentially how the British people saw it.
We talk about this in the show, but when you read about the level of taxation in Britain during that time, 25% tax on things like soap, and they were the highest taxed citizens in all of Europe, is my understanding. And the ratio of taxes paid between Americans and Britons were 50 times greater in Britain. So they had, it's kind of like, hey, pay your fair share.
We're still this people. We demand so much from government. We want state-of-the-art libraries, and we want fire departments and police departments, and we want EMT services and good hospitals and Medicare and Social Security, and we want excellent roads and bridges and airports and infrastructure, and we want a defense department second to none in the world, and on and on and on and on and on. We want all this, and then we say, but we're not paying for it. I mean, don't tax me. Well, if you add up, if you and I, let's say that there are 100 people listening at this moment, and each one of them writes down what they think government does for them, what they expect from government, and then start to add up what that would actually cost, then they would realize, oh, we're undertaxed. We undertax ourselves in the United States. If we really wanted to pay for all these things that we insist upon, we wouldn't be able to pay the freight. And so what we'll do is we'll borrow money from China and other nations, and we'll print money and try to see how much you can print without touching off too much inflation, and we'll pass on a national debt to some indefinite future down the line, maybe never, and we'll live this way without paying our fair share. So this is a very American habit. If you go to Sweden, they don't think this way. If you go to France, they don't, or Germany, they don't operate this way. This is part of the embedded software, the embedded attitude of the American people from the beginning.
In the show, you bring up how, and I think it's a great example, how Ireland still suffers from British occupation during that time. And we kind of have to look in the mirror and go, okay, we're conspiracy guys too. And of course, this all bubbled and bubbled and bubbled, and English Parliament screamed about these terrible children in America that deserved a caning, and it ended up in violence in the Boston Tea Party, which, by the way, gives me a great opportunity to brag about my bloodline.
Go ahead.
If you wish.
No, please, I can't wait to hear this.
It wasn't just the Boston Tea Party. I think there were 3 separate incidents where tea was either thrown in a harbor or burned. And on December 22nd, 1774, in Greenwich, New Jersey, 40 guys broke into a cellar where there was a bunch of tea hidden and burned it. And it was taken off the British ship, the Greyhound. And in 1908, a monument was erected on Ye Great Street in Greenwich, and it lists the name of all the known participants, including one Silas Newcomb and his son Ephraim, who are my ancestors. How about that?
I will now call you Ephraim from now on.
Well, it could make it in the podcast intro, probably not the show, but thanks for indulging me.
Some early Jack Swenson was throwing tea into the ocean. That's great to hear. Come on. I was with you till then, that. So, and by the way, whenever these people do this stuff in early America, they always dress up like Native Americans. And think of how unfair that is. They're going to throw tea in Boston Harbor, so they dress up like Indians. And then I guess they're hoping that Native Americans will be blamed for it. But obviously, you can always see through that kind of Hollywood makeup. But I've always found that really odd, this propensity to dress up as natives when you're going to do some disgusting thing.
And the phrase that they used was, "Rally, Mohawks, bring out your axes and tell King George we'll pay no taxes."
Well, now pretty soon you're going to join the Daughters of the American Revolution here. This way madness lies, my friend. I didn't realize.
I think my sister is a member, actually. So
you had bona fide connections to the early rebels of the country.
I had a relative that was at Valley Forge, but let's move on.
My relatives were from Detroit Lakes, Minnesota.
Well, it's just my pedigree that qualifies me for my position as semi.
I didn't realize you were a pseudo aristocrat in addition to being a natural one.
With that, shall we go to the show, or would you like to update people on what you're up to? I know you did at the end of the show, but it's a big day for you. Your book has gone to press. Or you have one more correction, do you?
No, I sent them all in, so it's so cool. I'll just take a minute on this. So I wrote the book. It's 2 years in the making. It's a lifetime.
Yeah, if I can brag about my heritage, you ought to be able to brag about your book. Go ahead.
Because this actually has some substance. But at any rate, so I wrote the book. It's about North Dakota, but it's really about more than that. It's about rural decline, and it's about the Great Plains, and it's about our relations with Native Americans, which, by the way, you've taught me a lot about. You really have, because of your important work with the Lakota especially, but Native Americans generally at Makoche, and your own personal relations with Native people, you've really helped me think about this. And I realized in reading this incredible new book, Lakota America, how even when you are a well-meaning person, as I think I am, you carry around a lot of dumb baggage. You just can't help. You carry around a lot of really dumb baggage. And so I'm learning. But anyway, the book is about that. It's about the future of agriculture. It's about the future of carbon. It's about the screwy and uncertain identity of North Dakota. It's about the geographic center of North America. It's about the kind of weird roadside effigies we throw up in places like North Dakota. And it's about the sacred Little Missouri River Valley, and a chapter also on the Bakken oil boom, which I probably disappoint some people by saying I think on the whole, it was pretty well handled. Anyway, by the end of May, it'll be a book, and I can't wait to put one in your hands. And we're going to have been talking to Beth, who's my administrative handler and producer, also with the Jefferson Hour. We're going to have a book launch party on Zoom for those who wish it. And we'll make a special arrangement for those who want to buy a copy as a donation to the Jefferson Hour, and so on and so forth. But I've written 14 books. This is, I think, far and away the most important thing that I've ever written. And it's a book that really does try to wrestle with the issues of North Dakota life. And you can't do that without breaking a few eggs, let's say.
You know how to combat that, don't you?
Yeah, leave.
No, say goodbye, put it to bed, and start another one. But I have to go back to your thing about Lakota America. I've started that at your urging, and I thank you for your kind statements about me. I don't think I've taught you anything scholarly about Native Americans, about Indians, but I may have given you a little bit of insight as to some of the social structure that exists today.
Well, yes, that and more. But even that is an enormous gift because, look, when we talk about woke or cancel culture or political correctness and so on, these terms get loaded with a lot of political baggage. But it's true that when you're dealing with, say, a Native American, you're standing at a bridge across a chasm that yes, we share many things, of course, and we have friendships and we get along and we work together and we work out jurisdictional issues together and we share resources and we're all Americans, of course. But there are ways in which, as you know, Native Americans have a kind of a different software that they can run if they want to, and non-Indians like me are fascinated by it, and they try to understand it, and we read about it. But in the end, these are acquired understandings, and you've gone through the very hard work, joyful work, but hard work over 20-some years of learning those protocols and learning about Native American humor.
Actually, I don't want to date myself, but it's more like 40.
But you take my point that you learn by generously and respectfully working your way through a series of communications that teach you about protocols that are different in some ways from the ones you and I would show if we were just having lunch together somewhere. And so that kind of cultural sensitivity is very, 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 very important. And I've learned a lot of it from you.
Really, it's all about learning to listen. And how about this for a ham-handed segue? So perhaps now our listeners could listen to this week's episode.
Well, they can, but just one more thing. So the book is out or will be out. And I want everyone to buy 100 copies because that way...
Now.
Well, I just said 100. And then my new course is coming, and that is Great Plains History and Literature. It starts on May 8th. And so I'm hoping for a very large group of people. We're going to read some very important Great Plains books. And then, of course, the summer tours and so on and so forth. But it's just been a golden, wonderful, challenging, exhausting, exhilarating time for me, David. And I am so glad that today I got to put my little finger on the return button and push send.
And we've both been vaccinated twice. That's important.
My left arm fell off, but I don't mind. I still have my right arm.
And I encourage people to take advantage of the opportunity to get vaccinated. It's the right thing to do, I think.
I'm street legal. Let's go to the show. I appreciate your friendship. I appreciate all the correspondence we get. Still hoping on a ranch, but that's down the road. Thank you, everyone, and let's listen now to this edition of the Jefferson Hour in which we attempt to get Thomas Jefferson to take the British perspective on the Revolution seriously.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Mr. Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay Jenkinson. I'm your host, David Swenson, and seated across from me is President Thomas Jefferson, and good to speak with you, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
Mr. Jefferson, I wanted to speak with you this week about things of a political nature, but I thought we might start with something perhaps a bit more pleasant. We're all enjoying the spring as it comes upon us, and I know your vegetable gardens are a priority for you at this time of year, but you also devoted some effort to growing flowers around Monticello, didn't you, sir?
Yes, I loved flowers. I wrote to my daughter once, "No sprig of grass grows uninteresting to me." I took great pride in the flower gardens at Monticello and took personal care of them. Much of the field work, of course, was done by others, and even much of the vegetable gardening was done by others. But I very much enjoyed working in those flower gardens and trying to bring a level of delicate beauty into my life in every possible way.
In 1807, sir, you wrote, "I find that the limited number of our flower beds will too much restrain the variety of flowers in which we might wish to indulge, and therefore I have resumed an idea of a winding walk. You created a sort of a special walk that was bordered by flowers, sir."
I like the sinuous. I had sinuous walls at the academical village of the University of Virginia, which I created in my retirement years. I like the notion of harmonizing with the contours of nature. There are almost no straight lines in nature. Think of a river with its oxbows and its sinuous curves. And so I tried to replicate that natural order in some of the things that I did in landscape gardening, particularly, both at home and at my second place at Poplar Forest, and then at the University of Virginia at Charlottesville. So I took enormous interest in all of this and tried to chart the appearance of daffodils and chrysanthemums and hyacinths and all the other flowers that I loved, to see if I could learn something about when to plant them, of course, but also to chart small changes in weather from year to year.
Well, I'm certain you enjoyed them, sir, as did your grandchildren, I understand.
Yes, my granddaughters took a particular interest in all of this and often spent time with me out on our hands and knees in those flower gardens. You lavish special attention on a flower because it has no utilitarian value. It doesn't feed you. It's just there for beauty. And I think that it's extremely important in a complete life that we surround ourselves with as many beautiful things as we can. And flowers add beauty without cost. So this was something that was extremely important to me, and particularly important because it did not have monetary or utilitarian value. It was purely decorative.
As you say, sir, you lavished attention on your flowers, and as I understand it, you also lavished attention on your grandchildren. But if we might move on to our main conversation for this week, I would like to begin with Benjamin Franklin's desire, when he was in England, sir, for a relationship of mutual strength and advantage between Britain and America.
Franklin grew up in one of the colonies, and he was a thoroughgoing Englishman. He had lived most of his life before the American Revolution. I was a young man at the time of the Revolution, just 33 years old when I wrote the Declaration of Independence, but he was already an elderly man, and his health was not great. I, in fact, visited him in the spring of 1790, just before his death. I had come home from France and had been named Secretary of State by George Washington. And as I made my way to the national capital, which was then in New York, I stopped to see Dr. Franklin. And it was a very moving experience. It was clear that he was dying, but he still had his old extraordinary wit. So he was a full generation older than most of us. And when we looked up to him as a world citizen, as a man of extraordinary capacity in science and in statesmanship and in publishing and in civic improvement. And it was important to me to remember that he had gone to England as a colonial officer, and at that time he did not see revolution coming. None of us did. And he worked hard on behalf of Pennsylvania to make sure that the relationship between the colony and Great Britain was clarified in some respects, to bring more economic opportunity to Pennsylvania and to give it more independence in its political life.
Well, as you say, sir, during the early 1770s, Dr. Franklin was no revolutionary. He was what one would call an anglophile. He had a great fondness for England. But Franklin was a visionary in both science and politics. And towards the end of his time in England, he was greatly worried about disunity in the American colonies.
Yes, he was not a natural revolutionary. I don't think that any of us really wanted to declare our independency. What we wanted was to be treated as full equal citizens in the British Empire. We didn't like being subordinated as mere colonials. We all grew up thinking we were British citizens, and a British citizen is entitled to respect and certain rights and privileges. They were being trampled upon by the government back in England. The government seemed to see us as a bunch of barbarians out on some godforsaken frontier across the Atlantic Ocean, and they failed to realize that we were every bit as much citizens of the British Commonwealth as they were. And so Franklin gave the first half of his life to making the best of the colonial situation, and he wasn't sporting for an independence movement. When it came, he wavered briefly about what to do, how to respond. He was a naturally conciliatory man, a man of harmony, a man who was not instinctively radical in his views. But when the British forced us into a state of rebellion, he soon accepted that and became one of the great champions of an American independence.
At this time, there was a great mutual dependence between the two countries in the years before the American Revolution. Britain owned 30 separate colonies in the New World alone, and it's said that immigration from the British Isles, particularly Scotland and Ireland, was exceedingly high, as much as 3% of the entire population per year. And this really concerned government officials.
This essentially takes us to the work of Malthus. Thomas Malthus wrote a famous essay on population that really became a conversation piece all over the English-speaking world. And his thesis was that population will grow in a way that exhausts the food supply, that at some point the reproduction rate of humans always gets beyond the capacity of the land base to feed it. And when this happens, you have the possibility of economic chaos, of urban mobs, of mass unemployment, of anarchy, and so on. And Franklin actually wrote a refutation of Malthus and said that has been fundamentally and permanently altered by the discovery of America, that America was going to be able to refute that, not only because of the sheer size of this continent, but by the fertility of our soils and the quantity of resources and timber, the sorts of things that can produce wealth for any nation. They were in such abundance in North America that Franklin felt that Malthus had simply been wrong.
Sir, looking back at the conflict that came up at this time, I see the British Empire it really as a business enterprise as much as anything. And in that enterprise, the Americas were a primary source of raw materials, and the colonists were steady customers of British goods.
Yes, we not only produced those materials, so we cut down the trees and put them on boats and sent them to England. And we made tobacco and wheat and indigo and rice and molasses and so on. And all of this went back into Europe because we didn't have a population large enough to absorb all of those products. And so we were doing the labor to produce this new wealth. We were extracting from the land in North America its extraordinarily fertile products, and then doing a certain amount of manufacturing here, but mostly sending them as raw commodities over to England. And so we were providing the wealth of Britain, and they were treating us, unfortunately, as colonists, as people not worthy of full respect. They, in some ways, were indifferent to us, but in other ways, openly exploited us. And then when we would send our timber or our wheat or our tobacco off to England, they would send back finished goods to us at exorbitant prices. And so they were using us as a customer base, and they were exploiting us there. At the same time, they were using us as a producer base to give them the commodities that made them wealthy. In other words, you think sometimes that the colonies were formed for religious freedom or for freedom in a broader sense, or that this was surplus population of England, or that people who had been convicted of serious crimes were exported to Georgia and Australia and so on. That's certainly part of the story. But colonies don't exist for that purpose. Colonies exist to extend the commerce and the resource exploitation of a nation like Britain. They didn't do it altruistically. They did it because they knew that if they could tap the gigantic resource base of the New World, this would bring them wealth. And they had seen it, of course, in Spain, which had tapped the silver and gold of the Americas. And the first explorers from England who came to North America, for example, Sir Walter Raleigh, were looking for gold. They were not planning farms, communities, and plantations. They were looking to get rich quick with minerals. And when those minerals were not available in Greater Virginia, then and only then they turned to the plantation of cash crops as a kind of almost a sullen alternative to what they were really seeking. But they soon realized that the resource base, just the timber alone of the New World, would enrich Great Britain almost as much as the gold and silver of Central and South America had enriched Spain.
Mr. Jefferson, we need to take a short break from this conversation, but you speak about the wealth of Great Britain, and when we return, I'd like to talk about that and what a precarious position Britain was in economically during that time.
Fair enough.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. And this week we're speaking with President Jefferson about the years leading up to the American Revolution. And sir, when we took our break, we were talking about the wealth of Britain, and it was really in a precarious position during these years. Britain found itself alienated, mostly through war, from many of its traditional allies, and they also found themselves in great debt because of those wars. For British perspective, let's go back to 1754 when the French and Indian War began. The conflict was really a boundary war involving England, France, and some Native American tribes.
Well, as I understand it, the war was about who would control the Ohio Valley. So the British were headquartered, of course, in England and in the colonies that we all know, the 13 original colonies of what became the United States. The French had French Canada and French Louisiana, so they had a very large holding in the New World. And the French wanted the Ohio Valley in the Great Lakes country. Of course they did. And assumed that it was theirs, not only because they were there and occupying it and improving it, but because of the doctrine of discovery. And the British, of course, opposed that. And so it was young George Washington, who then was relatively unknown, who was sent out into the Ohio Valley to do some reconnoitering and serve as a courier. And he helped, unfortunately, to touch off the French and Indian War. And then it became a struggle for colonial mastery of the interior of North America. And as you know, in the end, after 7 long, difficult years, this was a world war. Britain prevailed and took the Ohio Valley once and for all, but did not, unfortunately, banish the French entirely from North America. They still had a hold in parts of Canada. But this was really a cataclysmic event for France. And so this struggle of empires in the Ohio Valley was extremely important. It was the making of George Washington's reputation. I mean, after that, he was never not a famous man again, and it was clear that he would become the commander of any continental army that the colonies ever put together. But it was also a ruinously expensive war. These wars of empire, foreign adventures of the kind that Britain and France were engaged in, are bankrupting affairs. Even close to home they are, but at a 3,000-mile distance, the supply lines become ruinously expensive. So Britain won the war.
And during this time, American colonists called for aid. Britain answered. As you say, sir, they won, but victory came at a very high price. And Britain came out of that war with a sizable debt.
It was a ruinous debt. It was a gargantuan debt. And of course, the decision that was made, which turned out to be the wrong one, was that they would tax the colonies in some small ways. And the argument that they used was that they needed to pay off that debt, and we had been the beneficiaries of the war. We were the prime beneficiaries of the war because it opened the Ohio Valley to Americans and it protected us from French colonial expansion. And so they believed that we should pay part of the burden of reducing or eliminating that gigantic national debt. And that's what led to the Stamp Act and so on that produced so much resistance in the colonies of the United States.
And from British citizens' viewpoint, it seemed only fair that the American colonists should help. We need to think of the taxes paid by the average British citizen. My understanding, sir, is that they were the highest in Europe, as much as 25% or more on many common items. And the taxes paid by a British citizen were 50 times greater than the taxes imposed on American citizens by Britain.
Well, fair enough. I do understand the point that Britain was making. Here's where the struggle began. We were not consulted about these taxes, and we certainly didn't have voting power in the British Parliament. And so the rallying cry of our revolution was not we refuse to help pay our share. The rallying cry was no taxation without representation. We were not allowed to have a role in determining how to tax ourselves. And we didn't feel that the British government at 3,000 miles distance should have the capacity to take its hands into our pockets and remove money from them without consulting us and without including us in those decisions. It's a fundamental principle of human freedom that we tax ourselves through our representative form of government. We are not taxed arbitrarily and without consultation by external authority. And so that was the issue. Yes, of course, everyone loves to grumble about taxes, and we realized that Britain was the wealthiest and most powerful country in the world and felt that they probably could handle their debt all by themselves. But we did understand that as beneficiaries of the war, it would be rational to suppose that we would help to pay off the debt had we been properly consulted, had we been included by way of representation in Parliament. I don't think there would have been an American Revolution.
Mr. Jefferson, it seems to be a struggle over sovereignty, but wasn't the root cause of all this actually economics?
Well, you could look at it that way, but I don't. I don't see it that way. The economics are a mere bagatelle as far as I'm concerned. It's a question of principle. So, we were all reading our John Locke and reading all of the other Enlightenment political theorists, including Adam Smith and many, many others. And what we learned was that when you live in a state of nature, and my goodness, we in America were much closer to a state of nature than people in Britain or Birmingham or Edinburgh. When you live in a state of nature, you create a social compact, you create a government, and then you determine how it will be administered, how taxation will work, how spending will take place, and who is represented, how your rights are represented in the Parliament or the Congress or whatever other body you create. That's Political Theory 101, and we were all reading this. This was the age of the Enlightenment, when everyone was writing a treatise on government and so on, from Rousseau all the way to, say, Adam Smith or Francis Ferguson in Scotland. And so we were alive to these ideas, and then we realized, Britain is taxing us, but we're not represented, we're not consulted. These suggestions are not put to colonial administrations, after which the state assembly, or in Virginia's case, the House of Burgesses, would debate this and vote on it. This was simply being imposed arbitrarily on us from outside. And so you could say it was about economics, but I don't think that covers the ground. I think that we were a uniquely highly educated people because of the Enlightenment in what's at stake in government representation and taxation, and that's what offended us so mightily.
Sir, in a recent book titled The British Are Coming, written by Rick Atkinson, he writes, "Many Britons now viewed Americans as unruly, ungrateful children in need of caning. Many Americans nurtured an inflated sense of their economic leverage and pined for the traditional policy of salutary neglect, which for generations had permitted self-sufficiency and autonomy, including governance through local councils and colonial assemblies that had long controlled fiscal matters. Things exploded after this, did they not, sir? It was more than just children who needed a caning."
Well, I can understand the British point of view. If I'd been born in Britain and raised in Britain and only looked on America as some faraway place, in the same breath as New Zealand or Australia or Africa, I might have had an illiberal attitude towards those colonists myself. How you grow up and the worldview that you establish in your own society, in your own environment, often determines how you see world affairs. But I happen to have been born in Virginia, and I also had been made to know all of my life that I was a British citizen, and I knew something from my reading of history and politics of what the rights of a British citizen were. And so they may have looked upon us as a recalcitrant child that needed caning or beating, as they beat their children in the schools of Britain. But that's certainly not how I saw it. And if you really want to work the economic figures, Britain gained infinitely more from the colonies than we did. They can argue of the cost of administration and so on, but the fact is we were fattening the British economy by doing the hard work of extracting wealth from the soil and the climate of North America, and most of that wealth wound up in Britain. So it was a bargain. If you actually worked out in double entry bookkeeping what they paid and what they got was dramatically more than anything they ever paid. And although they could whine about it, they knew that this was a great bargain, and therefore both Parliament and especially King George III made a colossal terminal mistake by alienating us and forcing us into rebellion. If they had just worked it out by providing some real representation in Parliament, or leaving it to us to determine how we wish to be taxed, or having open and mutually respectful conversations with us about retiring the war debt, they would have gone on to hold those colonies for many decades longer, and maybe forever, and we might have wound up being a Commonwealth country the way Canada and New Zealand and Australia are in your time. And it was colossal misjudgment that made them lose the American colonies. Once we had won the War of Independence, the British tried to re-enslave us by other terms, by economic exploitation and by ruinous tariffs, and by forcing all goods to be carried in British ships and so on. But they weren't able to do it. They tried. But by the time the War of 1812 was over, we had actually achieved economic independence of Britain too. So all I can say is that they made a very silly and fundamental mistake, because if you had taken a plebiscite in 1773 of the, say, 3.5 million Americans at that time, the overwhelming majority, 3-point-some million, would have said that they were glad to be British subjects, intended always to be British subjects, had no interest in independence of any sort, not in their own state, not for the collected states. We were loyal Britons, and they forced us into a state of rebellion, as I point out in the Declaration of Independence, where I say, these things are not done for light and transient causes. Imperfections and some abuses can be borne with patience. But when there is a pattern of systematic oppression, which is leading to tyranny, at some point, sir, we must stand up and assert our British rights. And we did. We were not pretending we were something else. We were pretending that we were full-on British citizens, and that's why we were so angry.
Sir, as a proud American citizen, I completely understand your viewpoint and endorse it. However, in Britain, particularly in Parliament, the feelings were far different. It was quite popular to endorse force to be used in the Americas. They felt that one small showing of British supremacy in the Americas and all its citizens would lie down in subservience. They really did not understand America, did they?
No, they didn't understand the genius of America. As John Adams put it many times, beginning with the Mayflower, the people who came here from Britain had been forced into some significant practice of self-government. They had no choice. So we're 3,000 miles from the home country. There's a whole world of things that have to get done, and you can't revert every moment to Parliament or to the court of George III. The time of communication is so great, it could be months or years before you get a reply. And so the colonials were forced into a kind of self-government from the very beginning. So that's one issue. The second issue is that Britain gained more from us than we gained from them. And they made the mistake of thinking that we were utterly dependent upon them, and therefore whatever happened, we would eventually acquiesce because we were so needy of what Britain could supply for us. And we saw it more accurately in the opposite way, that we had what they needed. And so we could bank on the fact that our national resource base, even in that very early period when we weren't yet even a country, was so valuable to Britain that they fundamentally needed us more than we needed them, and that even if we won independence, they were going to have to deal with us because it would be hard for them to get those commodities from some other supplier. So we felt that we were in the position of strength, and they misread that. And they felt that they were in the position of strength, and we rightly read it, that they couldn't in the long run enslave us because the supply lines were too long, that all we had to do was not lose the war and we would win it. That's the problem with an occupying army. It's extremely expensive. So we all understood this, and Britain didn't. I mean, they looked on us as Hottentots or pygmies or New Zealanders or some sort of primitive, barbaric people that weren't worthy of their full regard. And that mistake proved to be one of the most costly mistakes in the history of the British Empire.
So there was a great ignorance in Parliament in Britain about the strength of American character. And even Mr. Franklin, in the end, began to realize that, and it sent him home to where he belonged, in America.
Well, he was there as a colonial agent of Pennsylvania, and he was a very good British citizen. In fact, he sided with the British establishment through many of the petty quarrels with Pennsylvania. And I think he would have quite liked to have been hired by the British ministry and lived the rest of his life in Britain. But because of a misunderstanding, he was called into a building called the Cockpit, and he had to stand there with his hat in hand and be browbeaten and rebuked and humiliated and shouted at by British ministers for a couple of hours. And their savage treatment of this man drove him into a much greater skepticism about Great Britain. And it was one of the little, not very well-known causes of the American independence movement that he realized, that even if the criticisms had been just, that the savage way that they treated him showed their contempt for American colonists. And Washington found the same thing, by the way, during the period leading up to the French and Indian War and through it. He wanted to be a British officer, and the British found that ridiculous. And they overlooked him in promotions, and they never paid him what he should have been paid, and they didn't listen to him, even though he knew much more about how to prosecute the war than these British generals, who were very large, often gouty, frequently drunkards, often absentee. And so it was the condescension, the belittling, the humiliation of good Americans by the British, either here or in Britain itself, that finally forced us to realize they are never going to treat us with full respect until such time as we are another sovereign country, and maybe not even then.
Mr. Jefferson, I will end by reading what King George wrote in March of 1774. He vowed to stop the present disorders in America and denounced a, quote, dangerous spirit of resistance in America among his, quote, deluded subjects. I don't believe he really knew what was coming. Do you, sir?
He never visited the New World. Had he spent a day at the Natural Bridge in Virginia or at Niagara or at the confluence of the Shenandoah and the Potomac, or for that matter, even a day in Philadelphia observing the American Philosophical Society, he could never have held the views that he did, and he could never have felt so condescending towards American patriots.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Jefferson.
You are most welcome, sir.
We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson. I have tossed off my wig and tights, and I am sitting on a sunny day in North Dakota, virtually across from the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. David Swenson. And this was your idea, David. You've been reading Rick Atkinson. I think he's having a very interesting impact on you?
Oh, he's a terrific writer. And when I heard he had a new trilogy coming out on the American Revolution, I, of course, picked up a copy, and I'm still reading it. It's quite a long book, but his way of describing perspective is so good. What really struck me in the beginning of the book is that we have a tendency to forget the British point of view. As Mr. Jefferson said, it was quite wrong, yet it bears some understanding.
Well, I studied at Oxford for 4 years, and I had a friend at Hartford College, and he was British, and he was this wonderful young man. We were in our 20s, and he would come for tea in my rooms. This sounds very, very colonial, doesn't it? He would come for tea in my rooms, and I would brew him some tea, and we'd sit, and then he was studying this very period. He would say, "Now, you Yanks, you were just tax dodgers. You were just rebels, really. I mean, we all we wanted was for you to pay your fair share. If you had just been willing to pay even a little, this whole mess, this whole unfortunate business could have been avoided." All that sort of talk, and it was great to get that perspective. I'd never heard it before. And of course, the minute you look at it from a British point of view, you see their argument, not necessarily the justice of their cause, but you see the argument that they made. And for us, no taxation without representation. But if you were British at that time, you probably weren't represented then either. A very tiny number of British people were actually represented. Most people were effectively disenfranchised, and that the people who represented them often never stepped foot in their district. And so the whole system was very corrupt and very inadequate in terms of just basic representation, even for British white males. And then, so for the Americans to say, "Well, we're not represented," the British would think, well, who else is? I mean, you're asking for something that doesn't even exist here, so you're making an awfully big thing out of a system that's worked quite well for us for hundreds of years.
It really did work. I mean, you look at what they did with Ireland and Scotland. In fact, that no taxation without representation comes from Ireland.
The recent historiography, David, has pointed to the fact that the British warmed up as an empire in Ireland, that Ireland was its first Vietnam, that Britain behaved in an unspeakable way towards Ireland by reigns of terror and ethnic cleansing and really severe colonialism and treating the Irish as virtually as subhumans, confiscating their lands, torturing and imprisoning their leaders, breaking any resistance that they could possibly see. And so they did hear these cries from Ireland, and Ireland is still recovering from all of this. That was, let's say, 1550 or 1580. It's 500 years later almost, and Ireland is still recovering from that exploitation, and Ireland is still split along ethnic and religious lines because of the severe colonization of Northern Ireland by the British during the reign of James I.
You talk about how the Irish are still suffering from that, and you get no argument from me, but I have to wonder if we Americans aren't suffering from it as well. You read about that time and the reactionary behavior in parliaments and the reactionary behavior of Americans being so ready to take up the fight against this British imposition on their way of life. We still sort of have that kind of conspiracy theory mentality that you see this reactionary behavior in politics in America today. In fact, I talked to Joe Ellis about a week ago and we're going to have an upcoming conversation with him about Jefferson and guns. And he also said, Americans were birthed in a conspiracy, and we love conspiracies still.
Well, there's certainly something to that. I do believe if you look at the whole business of the American Revolution, it's not a one-sided story of these beleaguered, virtuous colonists and then the oppressive British master. It's much more complicated than that, and we Americans are born into propaganda and nursed in it all of our lives about all of this, and it's very firmly ensconced in our point of view. But it really is the case that the British had a very dim view of American colonial life because they weren't there. And the only person in the Parliament who was really more sophisticated was Edmund Burke, and who argued very strongly for better treatment of the colonies and that they should be regarded as British in the fullest sense of the term. But he was outvoted and often shouted down for the positions that he took. There was a great deal of vindictiveness, and part of it was, and you and I can certainly understand this as North Dakotans from recent events, but the British were offended that we would protest. And if you followed, as I know you did, the Dakota Access Pipeline controversy of 2016, when Native Americans protested a kind of colonial treatment by American capitalism, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the government of North Dakota, many North Dakotans were hurt, were offended. Like, why are they upset with us? How dare they? How dare they raise their protests against American and North Dakota policy? So you see the same thing. We're still in a colonial paradigm, but now we're the colonizers, and we occupy Native American lands. And although this has all been now kind of settled by law, treaty, and custom, we nevertheless, from a Lakota point of view, are still occupying their lands, and they feel that they are treated as colonial subservients and that there is a condescension in virtually all formal relations between the government of the United States and the Lakota and the government of North Dakota and the Lakota. And I don't think they're wrong. I think that this brand of colonial behavior is not just British, but the British gave us our variety of it, and it continues, I think, very much to this day. But maybe you see it differently.
Well, you said earlier that this was not a one-sided story, and I was so glad to hear you say that, because really, to me, that was the point of this conversation with Jefferson, is it's not a one-sided story, as few global conflicts ever are. But one thing we didn't get to with Jefferson was that he was the man who gave voice to these 27 grievances outlined in the Declaration of Independence.
Right. So as everyone knows, the Declaration of Independence was Jefferson's. He was the prime figure in the Committee of Five that drafted it, along with Ben Franklin and John Adams. And the Declaration really consists of three parts: the famous preamble, which is what we focus on, and then this long list of grievances against Parliament and King George III, and then the resolution at the end that these united colonies must and are free and independent states and can do all things that free and independent states do. So a kind of philosophical Enlightenment preamble expressing the political theory of resistance, and then B, a long list of indictments against Britain. They've quartered troops in our houses. They've taken us across the sea to be tried not by a jury of our peers.
If I may read one, in every stage of these oppressions, we have petitioned for redress in the most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. And then, a prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. I'm not certain that King George took that well.
Well, and this is so typical of Jefferson that when Congress got a hold of his draft, they cleaned a lot of this kind of talk out. They wanted it to be firm. They wanted it to be a statement of grievances. They wanted it to be a justification of revolution. But Jefferson personalized it in some ways, and you can hear it. Just read again what he says at the end there of the king being unfit.
A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. And then, of course, later, the phrase which is such a favorite of yours, that these facts be submitted to a candid world.
Right. So candid, of course, means a world that is open-minded, willing to listen to the evidence. In other words, if I present, he's almost speaking to an international jury. If I present the case to a world that is willing to listen respectfully and with discernment, these facts will prove without a shadow of a doubt that we have endured British oppression so long that now we have no choice, no choice, but to rise up and overthrow that government, that the justice and the righteousness of the thing are on our side. And he's counting on a candid world, not Britain, not the Parliament, not the king, but international opinion to side with the colonists after he presents this list of charges against the Parliament, the court, and the king. And it's a very strong list. He's not making it up. He's gathered this up from previous things that he's written and previous things that have been circulating amongst the colonies. But that's the heart of it. We don't even read this today. That's the heart of the Declaration of Independence, the preamble, which we fixate on, which of course is magnificent, one of Jefferson's greatest single events as a writer and a philosopher. That part was just sort of yada, 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 yada. Now let's get to the indictments. That's the part that had the bite in it. And unfortunately, we pay very little attention to it in our own time.
It's interesting to look later in Jefferson's life, 50 years almost after the Revolution, and how he felt about it. And there are a few letters between Jefferson and Adams that detail this. Adams wrote to Jefferson in August of 1823, quote, "I am no king killer, merely because they are kings. Poor creatures. They know no better. They sincerely and conscientiously believe that God made them to rule the world." And Jefferson answered in September, quote, "The generation which commences a revolution rarely completes it. Habituated from their infancy to passive submission of body and mind to their kings and priests, they are not qualified when called on to think and provide for themselves."
Jefferson is capable of saying some pretty snarky things about monarchy. He once said that all of the crowned heads of Europe, if molded into a single individual, would not be fit to be the head of a parish in the United States. And he said that these people are pampered from their childhood. They're stuffed with gaudy foods and are treated with great luxury and pampered, know nothing about the world. They live in a state of kind of swinish sensuality. And so he had all this kind of notion that this was part of his own justification for what the Americans had done, but he was scathing about it. And Adams, as you see in that letter, is much more fair-minded and just says, look, this is their system. They're born into it. I bear them no particular ill will. That system has its own customs and forms of dynamics. Ours is different. I'm not a king killer. It was just a fundamental mismatch between British monarchy and the kind of the spirit of democracy that was already brewing in the United States in the 17th century, much less than in the 18th. But Jefferson was much more wanting to satirize and condemn monarchy.
I kind of think that we can learn something as contemporary American citizens by looking back at the Revolutionary War period and understanding what in fact happened. Do you think there's merit in that?
Yes, I think that something that you and Joe were talking about, apparently, the idea that Americans are touchy, that they flare up in tax rebellions and don't tread on me, that conspiracy and some feeling of that someone's out to get us, someone's going to oppress us, someone's going to overregulate us, someone's going to overtax us, someone's going to take our guns away. That sort of thinking is endemic to the American character. It's not part of the Canadian character. We're separated by this thin line, this medicine line, the 49th parallel, and on the other side, they don't see it that way. They don't look upon life in that kind of a conspiratorial tone. So we were born in this. We're born in Patrick Henry, give me liberty or give me death. That sort of notion, live free or die, still the license plate motto of New Hampshire, I believe. That philosophy is central and deep in the American character, and you've just seen it. You've just seen it in the cataclysmic events of 2016, that the people who hold those views don't want to wear masks because it feels like they're being tread upon, and they don't necessarily want to be vaccinated because they're being told to, and they don't want to believe that the election was fairly won by the Democrats because they believe that it was stolen, and they felt when they sacked the Capitol on January 6th that they really felt, David, that they were in the best tradition of American rebelliousness. They felt that they were the true patriots with a capital P. And so that dynamic is very deeply woven into the American psyche, and in my opinion, it's a largely ruinous dynamic.
Thanks, sir, to you and to Mr. Jefferson for sharing your thoughts on this subject. I thoroughly enjoyed it. In the short moments that we have left, I know you're a busy guy. You got books coming out. You got classes you're teaching. Any updates for our listeners?
I just want to say two things. This morning, I pushed send, and the last corrections to the actual page proofs of my big new book on North Dakota went back to the press, to the publisher in Virginia. And so I've, for the past 40 hours, 35 hours, I've been reading through this book line by line, jot of punctuation by jot of punctuation, and so on. And finally, after all this time, 2 years, I have finally pushed send. I'll get one more version of it to make sure that the corrections didn't introduce new problems. But after that, by the end of May, my book, The Language of Cottonwoods, Essays on the Future of North Dakota, will be out. And I just say to all of our friends and listeners, if you respect what we are and what I do, I hope you will consider reading this book. And secondly, the courses that I'm teaching are going great guns. The one that's coming up that I urge people to sign up for is The History and Literature of the Great Plains, and it will feature some marvelous books. My Antonia by Will Lacather, Plain Song by Kent Haroff, Anne-Marie Lowe's Dust Bowl Diary, and my own book. So those courses I'm just having the greatest time in the world with. The Jefferson Hour, we're planning more Zoom Town Jefferson Hour meetings, and there will be a Jefferson Hour book launch of my book in a few weeks, so stay tuned. The way to get on top of all of this is to go to jeffersonhour.com, and people can find information about all the courses, all the cultural tours, the books, and everything else there. And then those who wish it can read my work at governing.com, which is an online journal published from Sacramento, and I've been producing roughly one long-form article or interview per week for governing.com. So all of that is swirling around, my friend, and I can't wait to put a copy of The Language of Cottonwoods into your hands. I'll actually have to show up at the barn.
Thank you so much, sir. I look forward to getting that book. And with that, let's say goodbye for this week.
We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any show for a $12 donation, please call 701-575-0727. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.com and on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.com. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Bach Cello Suite No. 3 in C Major by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program, Through the Eyes of Thomas Jefferson.